With that, I'd like to introduce our curator, or actually, yes, our curator of special collections and special exhibitions, Dr. William Jeffett, who has been working tirelessly to put together the wonderful exhibition we have upstairs. And he is going to be introducing our speaker and also will conduct a Q&A moderation at the end. So please join me in welcoming William Jeffett.
Welcome and thank you. We're very, very happy to have with us today one of the lenders to our exhibition, Timothy Baum, who is also a very important collector, art dealer, and art expert, as well as many other things, including a writer. He's had a lot of connection with the museum over the years, and did an exhibition quite a long time ago of Man Ray's photographs for the museum. As well, we had an exhibition of surrealist prints from the Kaplan collection that was basically curated by Timothy. And also, he found a fantastic Dalí print for us that we bought 3 or 4 years ago. So there's been a lot of connection. He's much more than an art dealer. He has a deep knowledge of art. He's knew many of the surrealists. He's very engaged in the literary world. And most importantly, he met both Magritte and Dalí. He knew Dalí on several occasions, and he met Magritte only once. But there are very few people that you'll be able to have access to that actually met both of these artists that are the subject of the exhibition. And Timothy also met many, many interesting writers and artists and other important people, and is putting together a book about his experiences. And he's going to talk to us a little bit about the part to do with Magritte and Dalí in particular today, and then afterwards I may ask him a few questions, and then we'll open it up to you if you have questions. So it's with great pleasure I welcome Timothy Baum.
Okay, so as William said, it's probably why they invited me, that I'm about the only person they could find who actually met, not so much Dalí, because he lived, until the late 80s, but Magritte, I think he wasn't quite 70 when he passed away, and that was way back in 1967. I was like a kid. But I did have the opportunity to meet him. So I'll explain how. Back at that time, a friend of mine and I had a magazine that was called Dada. And Dada was basically, it was mostly poetry and then art a bit. But Dada was our, real, God at the time. We loved the Dadaists because they were the naughtiest boys, and but in this second number of Dada, and it only had 2 numbers. I did well, no, because I got married young, and that was the end of that. I had to stay home, behave. But anyway, in there I did a section on Magritte. And I think there had only been one other magazine that had ever really, brought America's attention to Magritte. But I was rather astounded, when I first saw his images, because, as you will see or have seen in this exhibition, he had, an unbelievable imagination. So, we were all pretty, I'm talking when I was like 24 or something. He overwhelmed us with these, really crazy, wonderful images. So, I'm just going to talk a bit now, and then this book that I've been writing, it's a book that a friend of mine, who's a publisher out in LA, he called me a couple of years ago, and he said, every time I'm with you, you always come up with these amazing stories, which I know are true, because that's the nature of your personality, that they would be. of all these amazing people that you met, and you got to write it down. And I said, well, it's possible. And he said, no, no, seriously. And the reason that I met a lot of amazing people was that when I was 21, after college, I started a job with an advertising agency which lasted about a week. Because I had been the editor of my college literary magazine, I got hired to work in an advertising agency as a writer. But the old-timers who were tough boys, if you ever saw Mad Men on TV, that was that era. And I come in like a sort of preppy kind of guy, and they didn't like me at all. So except that I could drink with the best of them, I could not readily communicate with the best of them. And after a week, I told the guy who had hired me, you know, I really, this isn't for me. But I was really a writer, and I wanted to pursue that. So I worked at just some other, you know, job in a department store to get enough money to get on a boat in September and go to Europe. And like the second day out, I got real sick. And I couldn't believe it because you don't have too many chances to take a lovely trip to Europe on an ocean liner. And this was one of the French ships. It was really great. But I had this high fever, I don't know, like a flu kind of thing. And I was just wiped out. And I was so disgusted, you know, that I couldn't have fun and, you know, to chase the girls and play poker and all the things you're supposed to want to do, and that I did do. So rather than just sit and be gloomy, I decided, oh, I'll go and sit in the beautiful library of the ship, and I will maybe write a short story or two or something. But I really was, I had this fever and everything, and I just couldn't concentrate like that. And then I couldn't read. It was really awful. So then I had a little brainstorm, which changed my life completely. And that was to make a list, little by little, of the 100 people in the world who I would most want to meet. And I've never met anyone else who ever told me that they or someone they knew ever did anything like that. But I did it, and it took me almost the whole 4 or 5 days on that crossing to do it. But when I got off in France, I had my list of the 100. And I had no idea how I was going to, break the ice and start meeting the people. But I had a letter from Jean Cocteau, who I met totally by accident in New York when I was about 16, where I went into a place to have some coffee at midnight. And there were a couple of drunk guys who were asleep in the corner. And then there was this one man who, unlike me now, was sitting with this kind of posture and this beautiful profile. And I knew what Jean Cocteau looked like, and I thought, wow, that's an amazing resemblance. But it's on 23rd Street in New York City, so unlikely. But I went over, and I tapped him on the shoulder, and I said, excuse me, and he said, yes. And I said, I'm sure you've been told this many times, but you really look a lot like Jean Cocteau. And he said, c'est moi. I said, you're Jean Cocteau? Yes, I think so. I said, well, what are you doing here? And then he explained that there was something called the Living Theater that did experimental theater at that time. And they had brought him over to do the first time ever of presenting one of his plays in New York. And they put him in a famous old hotel that's quite old called the Chelsea Hotel. And he, I guess because of jet lag before it was called jet lag, just was so off on the hours that he found himself awake. He goes into this place for a coffee, and I turned up. So I was like, oh my God, Jean Cocteau, this is so cool. And he said, I am amazed that kids your age in America ever heard of me. And I said, well, you know, the ones that are really into poetry and literature, they would. And, well, that's wonderful. And I said, and I was just sort of gushing. And I said, well, listen, you know, if there's anything I could do for you during your stay to make it more pleasant, just let me know. And he's looking at me like, you know, but he was flattered by that. And then he said, well, in fact, there is something maybe you could help me with. He said, I was at dinner earlier, and the lady next to me at a certain point knocked over her red wine glass, and it went all over my white suit. And I was hoping to wear this suit tomorrow night, but it's a mess. And he said, in Paris, we have something called nettoyer à sec, but I don't know here. I said, no, that's called dry cleaning, and we do have it everywhere. So he said, oh, dry cleaning, oh, that's nice. So, and I said, listen, what time are you going to be up tomorrow? Well, you know, I probably wake up early with the time change. I said, why don't I meet you around 9:30 in the lobby of the hotel, and then we'll go and get your suit cleaned. So he was quite pleased with that offer, and I was there, and of course didn't go to school. But anyway, there he was sitting there in the perfect posture with this little messy white suit. And we went maybe 100 feet away. It was the first dry cleaner. It wasn't too difficult. And then I, you know, explained to the people, this man's very important. And, you know, he has to do a very important thing tonight with one of his plays, and please. And the people couldn't have cared less, except they said, well, yes, but what time do you need it? I said, let's say 3 o'clock. They said, is 4 o'clock? Yeah, and he'll pay double? Yes, he'll pay double. So then maybe I went back to school for an hour or two, did him a favor, you know. And then I was back, and I picked him up again, and we went, and luckily the suit was nicely clean. And he was really appreciative. And then he said, and this is for you, and gave me a ticket for that opening night of the play, which was, you know, very nice. So I went, and then sat with all these, you know, cultural big shots and all the older poets. I was a younger poet. And, you know, a whole world of people that I had no access to ordinarily. And the play was pretty good. And then when it was over, and everyone came out into the little lobby, he was there in his white suit, looking extraordinary, and surrounded by, you know, people that were, you know, congratulating him and blah blah blah. And he saw me, and he said, and then he excused himself from all of these important-looking people, and he said, you know, you are my savior. I mean, look. I said, no, you look great. And he said, and this is for you. And he handed me an envelope. And I was afraid that he was giving me money, you know, for helping. And I said, no, I can't take, no, please. It was my pleasure and blah, blah, blah. No, it's not what you think, please. Well, okay. And he said, I would love to bring you to the dinner, but you know, it's not my dinner, so I'm just a guest myself. But I hope we meet again, and maybe we had a big hug or something. And then I go out into the street, and as soon as I got under a street lamp, I immediately opened the envelope, and in it was a letter from him that was really, I still have it, of course. You know, je suis votre ami, and anything I can ever do for you, please don't hesitate to ask, etc. And he did a little profile drawing. That he was famous for this one sort of kind of drawing. And with that, when I got off that boat and went to Paris, I had something that maybe would help. And I knew from talking to him a little bit over that coffee, because I told him I was very into Dada even then, And he said, oh yeah, I was very close with, and he mentioned people who I assumed he would have known. So I used the letter to call a couple of those people, and had success, meeting the first one, and then once I would meet somebody, and they'd say, you should really talk to so-and-so. And I discovered at 21 that these older people, despite being very famous, were very happy to have a 21-year-old come with full admiration to want to meet them. And so I had surprisingly good success over the next 2-3 years with my list. And I think I met maybe 70 out of my 100. And also, because I started so young, by the time I was maybe 25, 6, 7, a lot of these people were gone, and including Cocteau, who I think he died in '63, and Tristan Tzara, who was one of the two founders of Dada, '63, and Edith Piaf, who was on my list. It wasn't just artists and writers. She died the same day as Cocteau. I mean, there was a whole thing. And then Huxley, I happened to meet out in California just by coincidence, but he was staying with friends of mine. And that was, I think he died in '64. So I was very fortunate, because if I had done that list when I was 30, I would have been out of luck. And I was telling William at lunch, we just had a bite of lunch together, that if I had ever been a teacher, high school, college, whatever, my first assignment would have been that everybody had to make a list of the 100 people they most wanted to meet. Because, I mean, it changed my life, it broadened my life so completely. And you really grow up in a hurry, because you have to know how to talk to these people. If you're going to just sit there and say, oh, they don't want to hear that. They want to hear why you admire them and what you've read or what you've seen. So you really have to be ready to have a conversation. And it was very gratifying, all of that. So I also told William that if it was today, and I really hate to say this, if I was to make a comparable list, I don't think I could come up with 10 people, seriously, today, who I would be that anxious to meet. And believe me, 5 of them would be sports stars. I mean, I'd be happy to meet Jeter. And I'm not a Yankee fan. But anyway, it's shocking to me that that's the case. But I mean, I've met a lot of the artists of today just because I'm in New York and I do things with art. But in terms of writers of now, there is not a single writer in America who I would want to meet. But then there was Saul Bellow and Hemingway and J.D. Salinger, of course, I never got near. But so many great writers. And today, I mean, everybody has their read a lot. They'll say, oh, no, there's Jonathan Franz and there's this and that. But for me, there's nobody that I really would need or wish to meet. So that's sort of sad. And then among artists today, I don't know. I mean, I met Jeff Koons, but I can tell you it was no thrill. No, really. I mean, his only subject is himself. And as much as I love Buster Keaton, which is the only one of his works I adore, he's got Buster Keaton walking with a little, I forget what, a little burro or something, and he's looking like that. But other than that, I'm really a real lover of great art and literature. And, my heroes are people, like Hemingway or Salvador Dali. So, but because I got that head start, I got lucky with Magritte. Dalí was a no-brainer. All you had to do was find somebody who knew him, and then you come, and he loved having people around him, so that was different. But Magritte, he was a funny guy. So I'll read you later the little thing, and then they're short. But with Magritte, it was 1965 at Christmas time, and he had never been to America. He didn't speak any English, but the people who bought a lot of his paintings were the Menil family down in Houston, who then built their quite wonderful museum. And they were a very elegant old family, and they had money, but they really were great patrons to Magritte and Max Ernst and a couple of other people. So they invited him over, and I think he was to have his first big show at the Museum of Modern Art that winter. And so he came to America for the first time, and he went to Houston, and then on the way back he stopped in New York. And I had this older poet friend. There was an English-Irish poet called Reevy. And Reevy and Magritte were old buddies from the late 1930s. And Reevy, in my magazine, I published Reevy, and then I had this section on Magritte. So when Magritte came, Reevy, who had certainly no money at all, borrowed money to rent a limo and picked up his old friend, Rene Magritte, and then he let me come along, and we had a whole day of driving around with Magritte, who was like a child. And not only that, but when I read you the thing, I'll go into more detail, but he was wearing a 10-gallon hat that the Menils had given him as a farewell gift from Houston. And he was just there like a kid, just the happiest kid in his cowboy hat. And that was my way of meeting and learning something about Magritte. Dalí was a different thing, because Dalí was not in any way shy. And he would spend the winters in New York at a sort of elegant hotel called the St. Regis Hotel. And they have a great bar there. And every day, sort of from 5 to 7, he would hold court in that bar, King Cole Bar. And it would be all different types of people, but some friends of mine introduced me to him, and bless you. And I speak Spanish and I speak French, because I knew when I was going through school and college, somehow I should learn Spanish and French, and it really did pay off over the years. But anyway, with Dalí, it really paid off, because he spoke the 3 languages together, and any sentence would have the 3 languages. So it was helpful if you knew at least 2. If you want to know anything about it. He babbled, but he was a real, there's one of the books about him, maybe he wrote himself, Diary of a Genius. He was up there. I mean, he really was quite something, with his mind. So I spent a lot of time with Dalí. And there's this show now here, this lovely show of Magritte and Dalí. And I have to tell you that Dalí did not admire Magritte. He said, oh, he has wonderful ideas, yes, they're very cute and clever, but he's not a great painter. He said, I am a great painter. Picasso is a great painter, not Magritte. We know what to do with a brush. We can paint anything we want. Magritte, he should be painting billboards. So that's a little bit true, because if you look closely, the ideas blow you away. I mean, nobody that I've ever encountered had an imagination like he does. But he's not a skillful painter, if that's what matters. Like in the 19th century, these guys who could really do anything. And, and Andrew Wyeth, he could do anything. But Magritte, he really just painted the idea. So they are very different, these 2 guys. And I have equal respect, but my respect for Dalí is on a much higher level, because Dalí really could paint almost like a Renaissance master, except that his subject matter, was very wild, and he was very influenced by dreams and then when Freud came into the world, he was very devoted to that sort of thing. And I'll just tell you one tiny little anecdote, that when Dalí it was arranged where he could go and meet Freud, he went, and Freud, was just very dignified, like a professor, with a white beard and a very uncomfortable-looking tweed suit, and just an old-fashioned gentleman. And Dalí, who already had the mustache and everything, he came in, oh, hey. So they spent some time together, and then he said to Freud, do you mind if I do your portrait while I'm here, because we might never meet again? And Freud said, well, okay. I don't have much time. No, I'm just going to do it. So he had a little sketchbook, and he did the little portrait, and then he said, okay. And Freud said, could I see the portrait? And he said, well, of course. And he showed him, and he had done a drawing of a snail. Okay? And I can imagine Freud, who's big. Oh, yeah. Well, that's cute, Anyway, I have to go, So you know about that? Yeah. Right. All right, so now the next part's going to be very short, because this book that I'm writing, that my friend in LA forced me into doing, but I'm enjoying it, but I only do it when I have time. So the chapters are all very short in this book, from like 1 page to maybe 4 each. And I don't know what the title of the book will be, but the subject of it is basically interesting friendships and encounters. So obviously the Magritte one, the One Day Only, is an encounter. And Giacometti I met at a parade on Fifth Avenue, where it was a similar situation to Cocteau, where I was watching the parade, and as I was pushing my way out from where it was a little crowded, I see a guy who looks just like Giacometti. So I did the same thing, excuse me, but I'm sure I'm blah, blah, blah. And again, but it's me. And again, well, what are you doing on Fifth Avenue watching the Columbus Day Parade? And he said, well, I'm actually here because the Museum of Modern Art is doing a big retrospective. And I had lunch with my dealer, and he's very busy. So beautiful day, I walked around, heard some music, and here I am. So I said, well, that's really great. Oh, man. And I never saw him again. But, so the book that'll be sort of fun, because it's the man Ray, who I was the most close to. I represented him for several years, again, when I was pretty young. There it was a real friendship. So, it varies. But for these two guys, I'm not sure which. I have to say also that I'm just reading it to you as I wrote it, and I have to reiterate that Dalí did not really admire Magritte. And something I don't think I mentioned in here, but in the late years of the Depression, when a lot of artists were really broke, and a lot of people in general were really broke, both of them had the good luck to have a patron, an English guy that had a nice trust fund that sustained him through his life, called Edward James. But he really did love art, and he adored Dalí's work in the 1930s. Who wouldn't? And then, but he also had a great admiration for Magritte, and so he commissioned both of them separately, to do various paintings, and he did get both of them through that difficult period financially. But in the end, William was explaining to me that he thinks that each of them, but particularly Magritte, tried to get him to give more money, which is not a good thing to do if you're already being helped. You know, you just have to have a little humility. But I guess that behind each of these guys was a wife who really did some pushing of their men. And Gala, the wife of Dalí, in the later years, she was the business mind, or she could say yes or no and kill a deal or make a deal. And Magritte's wife, Georgette, who I think was, there's a video upstairs that makes her look like real fun and cute. My guess is she wasn't too much fun at all. But he loved her. I mean, and another thing with the Surrealists, many of them, most of them were married, but very few of them had children. And my theory is it's because they were children. I mean, they never really grew up, these guys. But there were no children for Magritte, Dalí. Duchamp had a daughter that suddenly appeared when she was 65 years old. And he was, you know, at the end of his life. But in general, that wasn't, the family wasn't the real center of their lives, which is too bad because it would have been nice to see what Dalí Jr. would be doing. You know? I'm sure Magritte's kid would just be doing exactly the same thing, and we would not be happy with that. So I'll read Dalí first, and then get it over with, because it does mention his lack of admiration for Magritte, unfortunately. And luckily, the people who were here last night for this other little event from Belgium, they've gone. So I don't have to have them going like that when I tell the truth here. But I know those guys, but they wouldn't have. You know, they wouldn't like it so much. So anyway, for Dalí, so it's just Salvador Dalí. I saw Senor Dalí on frequent occasions because he spent many winters at the St. Regis Hotel in New York. Period. No, it looked like a comma, you know. Okay. Where I use parentheses, I'm going to say parentheses. Okay. I originally encountered him there at the St. Regis Hotel, accompanying a young friend of mine, John Palmer, and his extremely beautiful professional model wife. I think her name was Ivy Nicholson, to drinks with Dalí in the hotel's famous King Cole bar. Parentheses, John and his wife were posing for Dalí at that time. On subsequent occasions, with various groups of his acquaintances, admirers, or business associates encircling him, I joined the Dalí table, usually from about 5 to 7 p.m., and met quite an assortment of people of every sort of profession and nationality. Parentheses, Dalí, especially under great influence from his wife, the inimitable Gala, was usually open to just about any sort of proposition as long as it was beneficial to him. Because at the end, he did a lot of commercial kind of things. He designed a Cadillac car, and he did a movie that never happened with Walt Disney, but he was all over. But that's okay. Andy Warhol put him to shame. Okay, on subsequent occasions, with various groups of his acquaintances. Oh, no, I'm sorry, I just read that. Okay. One day that I remember particularly was when Dalí, descending from his suite a little later than usual, arrived at the table in a state of extreme excitation. Soon after taking his seat, he withdrew a small black case from an inner pocket, from which he extracted a pair of metal-rimmed eyeglasses. Quote, "With these, you can never be bored," he announced proudly, affixing the eyeglasses to his face. This unique pair of glasses was composed of two separate circles of glass held together by the metal rims. Between the two layers of glass were a group of frisky black ants crawling about in happy abandon. "My little family," Dalí exclaimed proudly, regarding the ants scurrying about directly before his excited eyes with childish glee. So he puts on this pair of glasses, regular glass, but where there's two pieces of lens, not one, and he has ants in there, and they're just running around. And in a lot of his paintings, he had ants in there. But so he didn't need any of us. I mean, he was in heaven. And it was rather an amazing thing to see. So then a few minutes later, he said, "And now it's feeding time." We all stared in admiration and wonder as he removed the eyeglasses and then lifted up the upper lid of the frames and sprinkled particles of salt into the space between the two lenses. Immediately, the ants rushed madly about in quest of their dinner. Everybody at the table, including the host, watched this little ant ballet with great admiration. This surrealist gentleman might have been controversial and enigmatic, but he certainly was never uninteresting or boring. Okay. Another aspect of Dalí was his assuredness of his own greatness and superiority as an artist. Nobody, according to him, could draw with such skill and exactitude as he himself. In this boast, he was not far off the mark. Dalí, as draftsman, had few, if any, contemporary peers. I mean, he really, when he set his mind to this guy could really draw. One area of endless annoyance to Dalí was when anybody compared him to Rene Magritte. Quote, "Magritte cannot draw or paint. He is an amateur. He makes cartoons and posters, not painting." On and on he would banter like that whenever questioned. Get ready. One night, after having a drink with Dalí, who liked me because he could speak Spanish and French, no, they liked me because I could speak Spanish and French with him, if for no other reason. Because I never felt that I mattered to him very much, but that was good enough. I suggested we go over to Yolis's gallery. Yolis had a very small gallery across from this hotel, up one flight of stairs, but he represented Magritte and Max Ernst, and the tour. He had some pretty good people in their older years where he managed to be representing them. So I suggested we go over to Yolis's gallery across the street, as it was the evening of the opening of a Rene Magritte show. Begrudgingly, in the company of the ever-present Gala, and perhaps one or two other people, we went to the gallery. The space was small, and the room was crowded with people. Eolus, a showman of high magnitude, was probably pleased to have Dalí in attendance. That pleasure would not last very long. After walking around the room and very cursorily examining the works on display, Dalí shouted for all the room to hear, "Any art student could paint these pictures better than him. This work is merde." This work is merde, is terrible. With that, he raised his cane, an ebony one, surmounted with a large chunk of jagged-edged crystal, and rushed forward to smash it against one of the larger paintings on the wall. Luckily for the painting, 2 gallery employees and I ran over and disarmed him of this cane just in time. I mean, he was inches away from destroying, like putting the thing right through one of the paintings. Luckily for the painting, blah, 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 luckily for the painting that we disarmed him, Dalí, angry and fuming, bellowed a final trilingual curse on Magritte and his work, and before Eolus could shout for him to leave, turned on his heel and emphatically, and contemptuously departed. After that incident, my relationship with Eolus disintegrated appreciably. The guy blamed me. I mean, that was cute. All right. I'll close with a second and final incident relating to Magritte. In August of 1967, at the time of Magritte's death, I was living with my wife and 2-year-old son in a rather undistinguished town on the Costa Brava called San Feliu de Guichol. On certain Sundays, when I could scrape enough money together, I and my family would take the train down to Barcelona, have a late splurging lunch at the elegant Ritz Hotel, and go afterwards to the bullfight at the Monumental. That was the big bull ring. On this Sunday in question, just as my family and I were about to enter the grand dining room, a commotion occurred briefly at the dining room door as a proud and elegant Salvador Dalí emerged, along with his wife and a small entourage, to the delight of the various people milling around in the lobby. I, with my son perched on my shoulders, hailed Dalí, and getting his attention, shouted to him that I had just heard that Magritte had recently died. Dalí, not one to ever miss a beat, immediately retorted in a very loud voice, Magritte is dead? Vraiment? Champagne for everybody. All right? Cute guy. That was the official end to a rivalry that in Dalí's eyes never could have possibly existed in the first place. When it comes to Dalí's extraordinary talent as a master draftsman, I certainly cannot disagree. As a diplomat, it was certainly better for the world that he opted for the brush and pen instead. And now for poor defenseless Rene Magritte. I only met Magritte once, but it was an encounter that lasted for almost an entire day, and it was not one I would call insignificant. An older friend of mine, the Anglo-Irish poet and translator George Reevy, had called to ask me if I'd like to meet Magritte. Parentheses, I had already presented a small section on him in my magazine, Dada, in its second and unfortunately final number that same year. Naturally, I replied that I assuredly would. Reevy, a pal of Magritte's from the late 1930s in London, had discovered that Magritte would be in town, parentheses, New York, for a handful of days, and had arranged to rent a limousine, something that he could ill afford to do, to drive Magritte around and show him the charms of his adopted city. Magritte, unfamiliar with New York, had accepted his old friend's invitation with great pleasure. I became involved because Reevy liked me, knew my deep respect for Magritte's zany imagery, and also knew that I could speak French. See, again, that taking French thing came through. A day or so later, I was picked up by the limousine chauffeur, joining Reevy and his usually talkative wife, who that day happened to stay quiet, thank God. And Magritte's wife wasn't feeling well, so Georgia, we didn't have her either. So it was really just the three guys and then Reevy's wife who behaved herself. So it was okay. Okay, so a day or so later it was picked up, or I was picked up by the limousine chauffeur, joining Reevy and his usually talkative wife, and then Magritte, and off we drove. Magritte was, as I thought he would be, round-faced and merrily mirthful. He was dressed somberly in a dark suit, dark tie, and white shirt, but instead of wearing his signature black bowler hat, his head was adorned with a 10-gallon cowboy hat, which seemed to delight him immensely. When Reevy joked him about the hat, he explained that he had visited the Menils in Houston prior to his arrival in New York, and that they had presented it to him as a souvenir of his visit. The hat never left his head for the rest of our time together. And it was sort of, it was so incongruous, this very, very sort of conservative-looking guy and this big cowboy hat with a big grin. He was so happy about it. The conversation that we shared was mostly a mixture of reminiscences of his happy London days shared with Reevy, his host there, Edward James, and other friends and acquaintances, and his anecdotes about his Texas story and questions about life in New York as we drove from one neighborhood to another. Parentheses, east side, west side, around Harlem, then down through Times Square to Greenwich Village and Little Italy, and including a tasty and agreeable lunch in Chinatown. I was able to talk to him about Surrealism and how and why he had opted to leave Paris at the time of its Surrealist heyday and return home to his beloved Belgium. We also discussed a variety of other Surrealists, his rival, in his mind, not Dali's, Salvador Dalí, André Breton, etc. I remember that I was pleased to discover that he viewed Man Ray, one of my personal heroes, with reverence. When the afternoon ended, we dropped off Magritte first, and then ourselves, with Reevy and me retiring to a bar on 3rd Avenue for a well-deserved drink in celebration of that immensely enjoyable day. I believe that Rivi and Magritte never had the opportunity to meet again, with the latter passing away a scant 2 years thereafter. I was in Barcelona, so it's a repeat, but in different. I was in Barcelona on the day of Magritte's death, and the only person I could think to call was George Rivi. He greatly appreciated the call. I also, by complete chance, encountered Salvador Dalí shortly after learning the sad news of Magritte's passing. This brief episode I have described in my separate Dalí chapter. So that's that.
Well, let's open it up to questions. I think that would be good. So just speak up so people can hear you.
Sure. So Dalí's assessment, artistic assessment of Magritte seems to be somewhat linear, and yours is not. Could you inform us on what Dalí is missing about Magritte?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I mean, when you look at Magritte's images reflecting his imagination are so brilliant that for me it's a blessing that he could paint at all. But he was better than at all. I mean, he's a perfectly good painter, but not by Dalí's standards, where Dalí measured himself against people like Vermeer. I mean, Dalí, and when you look at Dalí's paintings, particularly the earlier ones, he did things in detail that are so extraordinary that they look like they're, you know, colored photographs, but they're not, and they can be so tiny. I mean, he was brilliant. So he was unfair about Magritte, because Magritte wasn't trying to be the greatest painter of the 20th century. He was just, you know, sharing an immensely, you know, an amazing imagination, you know, with everybody who, you know, saw his paintings as they evolved. So it wasn't very nice of Dalí to be that grand. But on the other hand, you know, it happens, unfortunately, all through life. In other words, the greatest violinist is going to say that the guy that everyone says is the new up-and-coming one, oh, come on. He should be in a high school orchestra. I mean, you get that kind of thing. The big guy always, you know, if he's got particularly a big ego, he's going to always, you know, denigrate whoever is being suggested as a rival. So it was pretty much just that sort of thing. But for me, there's plenty of room in the history of 20th century art, you know, for both of them as very prominent artists.
Interesting.
You know.
Which pieces in the Magritte exhibition are yours that you've lent? And can you give us some information on like why you chose those?
What?
Which pieces of the special exhibition are you lending? And can you explain like what compelled you to purchase them?
There's one piece in the exhibition from Timothy,
okay.
and
Yeah,
and he
yeah.
can explain why he bought it and how he came across it.
Well, I mean, I love this museum, and when William said that I had helped with a couple of exhibitions, it was in the old building, and we had fun. It was, I think, before you were there, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And I'd never, until yesterday, I'd never seen this new museum, and it's extraordinary. I mean, really beautiful. So when William called me and said that they were going to do this exhibition, Magritte and Dali, which, by the way, I don't think has ever been done before. I don't know that, you know, it's the ultimate comparison of putting these two guys together, but certainly because they lived in the same period, they were both surrealists, and they were, you know, to a third person rivals, which is what infuriated Dalí, I suppose, because he just wouldn't recognize that Magritte was on his level. But that's, you know, why I was interested in the show. And then one of the paintings that really shows the most where these two guys overlap is a Magritte painting done in about 1935. He did two versions. It's a tuba, the musical instrument, the tuba on fire. And one's about this big and one's a little one like that. So a friend of mine's widow owns the little one, and they asked, is there any way that, since you know her, if you could convince her to lend it? But she and her kids, they love having it at home, and they've lent it to other exhibitions over the years, so they didn't want to do it. And also this show's going on to Belgium, and they just felt funny about it. And then the father in the family just passed away a year or two ago, so it was just sentimental. But it is in the little book, the catalog, which is a beautiful little book. You see it in there. And Dalí, I don't know which was first, the burning tuba or the giraffe.
I think the tuba was first.
Yeah, well, if the tuba was first, then Dalí appropriated it because he did a rather amazing painting that shows Harpo Marx playing the harp, and alongside him is a giraffe, or maybe more than one giraffe, in flames. So definitely he got that idea from the Magritte painting. And that sort of was why William called me. And then he said, well, do you still own any Magritte? And I said, well, I have this gouache. It's not very large, but it is very special. And it's a very short period where he did these paintings where they were in little sections, little squares, and in each square there was an object, and then beneath each object he wrote a word, where in the real world, let's say the object that's a glass of water, it would say, water glass, and a woman's shoe would be a woman's shoe, and the egg would be an egg. But if you see it upstairs, he just gives the most ridiculous title he can to each one. So I don't have them memorized, but I mean, let's say the woman's shoe, he called, a walk in the park or something. No, that would be too close. No, just something, ridiculous. Do you remember any of that?
Well, one of them is snow, and it's one of the other objects that was in it.
Yeah, platform, but I forget which one. But anyway, totally unrelated, and they're very clever. And he just did 5 or 6 oils like that, which are well out of my range of being able to ever buy one of those. But the little gouache, I'd seen it in a guy's house years ago, and I said to him, if you ever want to get rid of that and the price could be fair, I would love to have it. And he liked that I admired it so much. And then he lost my phone number, my name, but it turned up in an art fair. And a friend of mine called me. I wasn't at the art fair. This friend of mine called me and said, there's a little work here by Magritte that you, as a poet, will love to have. I mean, I don't know. And he said, the price is not terrible. So I went, and I ran around this big art fair for an hour and a half, 2 hours. I couldn't find it anywhere. And then when they started putting the lights on and off, I really was unhappy. And I went back to the dealer where I put my raincoat under her table when I came in. And I said, oh man, I'm so frustrated. She said, what's the problem? And I told her, and she said, look. And it was right, and she was the one that had it. So, and then we worked out a way that I could pay it in installments, and I got it. But anyway, there's nothing else in the show like that because there are so few. So that's what I lent to the show. It's just but I'm happy to have it, you know, because it shows one more dimension of you know, Magritte's, you know, really clever mind. So that's, you know, that's what I added to the.
Well, we're hugely appreciative to have it. It's a great contribution to the exhibition. Anybody else? Yes?
I got kind of a sideline question. You were associated with Edward James a little bit? You met Edward James?
No.
Oh, okay.
I think I would have liked to, because he seemed like he had, besides living in England and being a, you know, a real, not just patron but friends to these guys, he also had something in Mexico, which evidently was like a real surrealist kind of whole domain. But it was James who among other things, commissioned Dalí to make all the telephones in his house a lobster telephone, you know, with the lobster on top. And so if he had that kind of imagination, he must have been a fun guy. But no, I think I was one generation away from meeting him. So.
Yep.
Timothy, your 100 people to encounter it seems a marvelous way of organizing the aspirations of your life, and it's a real example to us, and I appreciate hearing about that. And I'd just like to ask you to name, well, tell us about your encounter with Ezra Pound and one other of your list of your choosing.
Did you want me to read one more?
Yes.
You know, the worst thing for me is if I lose this notebook, because I write by hand. I'm a total dinosaur, and I really, you know, worry when I carry this thing around. And I Xeroxed, you know, a certain amount of them, but then I've written more since then. Well, as proof of my being a dinosaur, my flip phone is telling me that I have a message, and it keeps vibrating on my hip. So wait. I pushed the button that said ignore. Well, if I read you all the ones I've written, it would be hard because everyone would want to hear something else. So I'm going to read to you Joseph Cornell.
Great.
And Joseph Cornell was a guy who was a real hermit. He didn't like being around people too much. He was very shy. He lived with his brother, who was in a wheelchair, who I think had multiple sclerosis or from a childhood on. And after the mother died, he and his brother lived in this little house. It was just full of, you know, boxes in various states of completion, and all these, everything he collected, all sorts of, you know, bric-a-brac, and you couldn't move in the place. So, but occasionally somebody would visit. So it's similar to the George Reevy bringing me into the, you know, picture to meet Magritte. So this is Joseph Cornell. I once had a call from my good friend and colleague, plus occasional tennis doubles partner, Dick Bellamy, asking if I'd ever met Joseph Cornell. I replied that I had not. He asked if I'd like to join him and his acquaintance, John Lennon, who I already knew slightly. I actually once sold a Magritte painting to John Lennon about 6 months before that, you know, asshole shot him. I mean, I couldn't believe that I had to lose John Lennon, because it was such a treat to share art with him, and then this bozo comes along and shoots him. But anyway, that's a separate story, obviously. But this day, I was able to, you know, be with John Lennon, as well as to go out in another limo to have the chance to meet Cornell. So I never met Joseph Cornell, I replied that I had not. He asked if I'd like to join him and his acquaintance John Lennon, who I already knew slightly, in a drive out to Cornell's house in Long Island. And he lived on something called Utopia Parkway. So I put that in parentheses, Utopia Parkway. Of course, I replied, yes. The next day, Bellamy, in a rented limo, and he's another guy that didn't have much money, but when you're dealing with John Lennon, I'm sure Lennon wouldn't have cared how we got there, but he was a pretty cool guy. But anyway, the next day, Bellamy, in a rented limo, picked up Lennon and myself, and off we went. Parentheses, the details of the ride out remain comparatively incidental. Because a lot of these things, like those quotes about Dali, those are real quotes. I mean, I actually remembered them because I have that long-term memory. I'm not so good about, where I had lunch yesterday, but I'm okay with the, 40 years ago kind of thing. Upon arriving at Cornell's place, a nondescript, and I've left it blank how many stories, wood frame, it was a wood frame house. I have to go out there and see if it's 2 or 3 stories. Bellamy bounded up the walk and rang the bell. After a couple of minutes, the front door opened slightly and a fragment of Cornell's face and body came into view. Bellamy chatted with him briefly and then returned to the car. Bad news, he told me, with a legitimately sad look on his face. He says he can't accommodate more than 2 people. Oh, shit, I probably thought. but agreed that since we all knew Cornell to be rather eccentric, I'd have to accept his decision. Lennon, and I recall this particularly, graciously said that I should go and he would stay in the car. So that's a beautiful thing. In the car, parentheses, limo. This I strongly refused, thanking him for his kind thoughtfulness, and waved goodbye as he and Bellamy walked up to the half-open door and disappeared into the house. About a half hour or so later, the 2 visitors reemerged with a shadow of Joseph Cornell bidding them farewell from the recesses of his doorway. I jumped out of the car and shouted to Bellamy, "Hey, wait, can't I at least say hello to him?" Bellamy, a look of doubt on his face, stopped Cornell as he was closing the door and uttered a plea on my behalf. Miraculously, Cornell assented, and quickly I was at his door, smiling at him face to face. I sputtered whatever words of flattery and respect came to my mind and extended my hand. Reluctantly, i.e. nervously, he extended his hand, a long, tapering, bony one as well, and briefly intermingled it with mine. That, for me, was a great and unforgettable moment. Some seconds later, Cornell muttered some word of apology, walked awkwardly backwards through his doorway, and hurriedly closed the door. That was the only time that I ever saw him. On the way back, Bellamy and Lennon told me the details of their fortuitous visit. Later, the 3 of us had a very enjoyable lunch together. So, see, that's why it's friendships and encounters. So for Cornell, it was 45 seconds that I met him. But still, I met him. And I always remember it, and I remember everything about it and his handshake. And so it was worth it, And that's why it's been fun writing this thing, because it, Giacometti at the parade or Cornell, and such like that. And then Dali many times, and you know, Andy Warhol, I was sort of part of that a little bit, because that magazine I published, I used his typewriter. He had an IBM executive typewriter, and I had a portable thing. So in exchange for being the night watchman at Warhol's factory for a couple of weeks, he let me do my whole magazine on his IBM typewriter and then have it offset. So that was, you know, all these things. But in answer to Hank, that was Hank, right?
Yes.
Because it's tough
Yes,
to,
yeah.
you know. I mean, if I had, I don't even know what my life would be, you know, in terms of, you know, the scope of it, if I hadn't done that thing. Because, I mean, I'm on the saddest, bleakest day, you know, if things just aren't going well, I can just think, if I want to, on all these people that I met, and I know how lucky, you know, I mean, you couldn't be luckier. And I'll read one more, okay? Do you want one more?
Sure.
Yeah.
All right. It's very short. Joe DiMaggio. Okay. This little memory is simple enough. My ex-mother-in-law, a good friend of mine to the end, called me from a payphone one day some 35 or 40 years ago and asked me if I'd ever met Joe DiMaggio. I replied that I definitely had not. She then reported that he was standing in the middle of her bank, obviously for promotional purposes, greeting people, and that she'd even smiled and said hello herself. I asked her which bank, left immediately to find some sort of sports store where I could quickly buy a baseball, bought one, and then as quickly rushed over to the bank, hoping that he would still be there. He was. Tall, well-postured, aglow, dressed impeccably in a dark blue suit, welcomingly open and friendly. I took my place in the line, awaiting my turn. When it did, I shook his hand, then asked if he would sign the ball I brought along. He took the pen that I offered and did so immediately. I then, to elongate the moment, mentioned that I was also a great fan of his brother, Dominic. This, as I hoped it might, seemed to bring him a special joy, and his smile spread wide enough to radiate the entire room. He's a wonderful fellow, he said, and a hell of a center fielder, I quickly added. Thank you very much, he said. No, thank you, I replied, patting him on the arm and walking happily away with my newly signed Joe DiMaggio baseball in hand. I think he even sensed I was not a Yankees but a Red Sox fan and probably didn't mind it a bit. God bless you, Joe. So that was fun sharing with all you guys.
One more question?
Continuing on the people you met, was there anybody that was on your list that after you met them, you said maybe they shouldn't have been on the list?
Well, they should be, no. Oh yeah, sure, there were people that, I don't remember anybody who glaringly was a disappointment, but I mean, there were definitely people who weren't as, you know, cute or funny or you know, outgoing as I thought. But I don't really have any terrible memory. But in my book, it's not just from the list of 100. I have a certain large amount of the book, or certainly a quarter or a half, somewhere, you know, a large amount, are people who I met, after, my list. And like, I don't know that I had Dalí or Magritte on my list. I just happened, because the list was done in 62. And then, the Magritte was 65. So, but I've been honest enough to include everybody who's of public interest. So with Richard Nixon, who I met twice. Once I met him in an elevator when I was with my grandmother, and she was visiting a friend in a building, and the elevator stopped, and Nixon and his wife got in. And my grandmother, just gushed, oh, President Nixon. He was no longer president. President Nixon, oh, such a pleasure to meet you. And he said, he was very, charming. And, oh, and who am I? My name is Ann Strook, and how do you do, sir? And this is my grandson, Tim. He put his hand out, and I turned my head away. Okay? Again, another time I was in a restaurant where I was celebrating a book that I had written with the guy who published it. And he was sort of a big shot kind of guy. And while we were getting towards the end of the meal, Nixon came in with a couple of other business kind of guys, and then as he passed by, my friend said, "Hey, Richard Nixon." And I said, "Well, do you know him?" He said, "Yeah, of course." I said, "Well, it's nice." And then when we finished, and Nixon and his friends were still eating, my friend, unwisely, as it turned out, said, "I just want to say hello." So we walk over just 2 or 3 tables away, and he said, "President Nixon, does one still call somebody president after they're president?" Yes. Do they? So, because I didn't remember. But, I mean, because he sort of left where you could have called him Mr. Nixon, No, it's like when they take your stripes off in the Army because you did, But anyway, he probably called him President Nixon. And he told his name. And Nixon remembered him. "Oh, it's great to see you again." And this is my friend Timothy Baum. We just did a book together. "Well, how do you do, Tim?" Turned on my heel. We got outside, my friend said, "I'm never taking you to lunch again, anywhere. I can't believe you did that." And I said, "You'll take me to lunch again." But so that's that. And then, there are a couple of people that I talk about in here where it didn't work out as wonderfully as I was hoping. And it's sort of fun to do that and not make it all sound, like it's so easy and wonderful. But basically, and particularly with the ones who are really getting up there in years, to have a younger person come with admiration. Like there's an English writer, E.M. Forster, who I consider a great writer. I mean, past his India and et cetera. This is a great writer. And he was still at Cambridge. I think he still gave lectures maybe a few times a year, but they let him keep his rooms. And I wrote to him, and he invited me to come up to Cambridge and have tea, which I was happy to do. And he received me very elegantly. He was an older man at the time. And we sat 3 or 4 hours and discussed English literature and American literature on as high a level as I could ever dream to discuss those subjects. And, it couldn't have been more charming. So, and he was on my 100 list and again, he didn't expect that, a young guy from America was particularly interested. He didn't know that he was acceptable here as he was in England. So, I mean, it was really fun. And I've never, ever met anybody when they heard about my doing this list, say, "Oh yeah, that's cool." No, that's more than cool. It's really, you really have to make an effort, and it was, you know, but it was amazing. And then when we were eating lunch before, the other guy with us said, he asked if I'd met somebody where I would have been 5 years old, but anyway, but then I said, but one of the people on my list was, of course, Picasso, and Man Ray, who became actually a quite good friend. He said, when I told him about my list, well, I'm going to bring you to see Picasso, because we're old buddies, and I haven't seen him in years. And then, but Man Ray was quite old, he was not well, and he got worse. So I never got to meet Picasso. Well, you know, it would have been nice. But I think it was, I think I got to about 70 out of 100. So, and I don't know where that, my original list, which was folded over so many times, I don't know where it is. I still have the Cocteau letter, but I don't know where that little list is, because I'd love to remember who the 100 were, you know, particularly the ones, you know, that I didn't meet. But it was really, by far, you know, the most really important thing I ever did in my life, I assume. So you can still do it, you know.
Yes?
Question. You said you had your 100 from then. Now you couldn't even come up with 10.
Yeah, it's a
The
problem.
question is it you and your perspective, or people less interesting that are out there?
Well, I'm hoping there are, and my 28-year-old younger son, he would say, "Oh, come on, man, you don't even know what's out there." And he's a musician and a writer, he lives in Berlin, and he could probably make a list of 50 himself. But the people that he's excited about, I'm not excited about. And it's just because I would be comparing them to these other greats. And my definition of great is probably different than today's, you know, definition of great. But, you know, for someone like my son, you know, he's much more interested in his time. And, you know, I don't think he'd want to meet Lady Gaga. I hope not. But he certainly would want to meet, you know, some of these terrific actors of today. And I guess in his music world there were people. But for me, on my list of 100, I had Miles Davis, Thelonious Monk. I had about 5 or 6 jazz musicians, all of that level. And there's nobody, I'm not that much of a listener to, you know, today's music, but you know, there's no Thelonious Monk that I know about. But my kid would say there is. He'd say there's a guy, you know, in Antwerp who can, you know, blow Thelonious Monk away, but he doesn't play concerts, you know, that kind of thing. So, yeah, I'm being a bit of a curmudgeon by saying that, but I really, except for sports heroes, I would have to, I don't know. I mean, I could try it, you know, but I don't think I personally would get past 10. And it saddens me, you know. But anyway, that's my answer.
Well, thank you very much. Is there another one? One more, and then we'll conclude?
Yeah, I was just going to say that, just hearing what you had to say, and your list of 100 people, and why you feel that you don't have an interest in these people.
What?
Interest in other people, the new, present, current thing. I don't know if it's a matter of the age factor. It seems like the people you've talked about, not only were they talented, but they also lived their lives.
Oh, and they were pioneers.
Yeah, they were, yeah, where the other people, I'm not saying nobody exists like that,
Yeah.
but you know those people based on, there's so much tied into the type of life they live that entwines with their art or what they've done.
Yeah, I mean, and also, at this point, the history books have evolved to include these people. I mean, they're proven. I mean, it might be that there are a couple of artists that I've seen in the last, 10 or 15 years where I saw why they were good, but it didn't really appeal to me. Maybe they become, I'll give you an example. Basquiat, who I happen to have met, he only he died at 27, I think. But Basquiat, I knew right away that guy, because he was so self-confident, he was such an outsider, but he did graffiti art, and he made it work. And at first, like hip-hop music, I mean, I can't relate to it at all. I mean, this morning, I was sitting by the pool trying to read a book where I'm staying, and all of a sudden, the girl there put music on. It was so awful, and it was pretty loud. And I said, could you just turn that down a little bit? And she said, well, I will, but once more people come, they want to hear that. I said, why? Well, of course, the answer is that nobody else there was going to read a book. I mean, forget that I was the only person on my airplane wearing a tie. I was the only person in the airport wearing a tie, except for a cop maybe. No, I mean, everything's changing, and I stick to the luxury of having, had the opportunity to meet the past, which was for me the present when I was, younger. And I just can't lower my standards. And if somebody wants to show me another, Hemingway or Salvador Dali, I'd be glad to know it. But I haven't made those encounters, either through reading about, the world around me or personal, encounters. So no, I'm doomed to being a curmudgeon.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah.
It's been wonderful. Thank everybody.